Let's review a few terms as we move into our further discussion here of the Neolithic Revolution. So the Paleolithic, we had referred to this as the Old Stone Age. In archaeology, we like to break the Paleolithic up into, for example, the Lower Paleolithic and the Upper Paleolithic. So lower Paleolithic tools would include the Oldowan tradition that we saw with Homo habilis, the Acheulean tradition that Homo erectus was responsible for developing, and of course the Mousterian tradition associated with Neanderthals. As we move into the Upper Paleolithic, we're progressing through time here. We're moving out of the Pleistocene and starting to move into the Holocene, and we see tools that are much more refined. So we're starting to see the development of arrowheads, for example. The Solutrean tradition gives us a great example of an arrowhead. Think First Nation arrowheads, very similar to the Clovis type that we see in our particular area. The Mesolithic refers to the Middle Stone Age. So now we're getting closer to the Holocene and the birth of farming. Mesolithic means the Middle Stone Age. And here what we're seeing are composite devices. Obviously, tools now become much more complicated. They're being manufactured with small chipped stone tools. We refer to those as microliths. And we're also seeing retouched bladelets. So a much more smaller, refined tradition has emerged. The Neolithic, this refers to the New Stone Age, and it's primarily associated with the invention of agriculture. So Neolithic tools then, they were invented to facilitate the harvesting crops, for example. So we're seeing polished rather than chipped stone tools. And like I said, this is ultimately for the purpose of cultivation and processing the foods that we're cultivating. Let's move on to the next slide. There's a number of questions that we can ask as we begin to look into the origins of farming. Why did it emerge? Where did it emerge? And what was the ultimate impact? So let's take a look at a few of these. And we can ask number one, why didn't people eat grains during the Paleolithic? I think this is a good question, and it really forces us to look back on the environment and the subsistence strategies that were common during the Paleolithic. Is it the fact that Paleolithic people didn't like grains? We'll come to that in a minute. Another question would be, what drove the invention of farming? Was it a matter of evolution that we said, hey, there's a better way to do things, let's become farmers? But as we've already learned, farming didn't produce more calories. It didn't mean that we had to work less. There's an obvious deficit here as we move to farming. So it can't be a matter of getting smarter and figuring out a better way to provide for ourselves. So we'll take a look at that as well. I think looking at the origins of farming, one of the most important questions here ultimately revolves around the idea, could we have avoided the invention of farming? And as I pointed out, Jared Diamond, for example, he said that farming was mankind's greatest mistake. There's some hyperbole there. But when I reflect on it, I say, well, yeah, it certainly had its problems, but we couldn't have avoided it. It was a matter of adaptation to a changing environment. And that's where anthropology is today. Finally, we could ask, how did farming shape human history? What role has it played beyond, for example, looking at the moving from a cultivating economy and ultimately developing an industrial economy and now being able to produce more food than we could ever need? What ways did it impact our health? In what ways did it impact the ways that we relate to each other? So let's take a look at a few of these questions. Let's move on to the next slide. When we look at the Paleolithic subsistence strategies, I'm just going to review here a few ideas that we've already talked about. We need to take into consideration the social structure, the food gathering habits that people had, and on the right side of the screen, we see a great example of how people subsisted during the Paleolithic. Now, this doesn't mean that they always went out and they hunted woolly mammoths and they constantly had these woolly mammoths at their disposal. This was kind of a rare event. And while we think of this as characteristic of the Paleolithic, I think we don't consider that there's a lot of trapping going on and hunting smaller animals. So a few points we've already talked about. Here we're seeing foraging. Individuals certainly collected shellfish. They collected berries, eggs, nuts, roots. And if you're thinking of this from a paleo diet, this makes a lot of sense. This type of stuff fits into that paleo diet. In addition to shellfish, berries, eggs, nuts, and roots, they hunted large and small animals. Meat was a focus at this point of time in our history. We've pointed out that these individuals were nomadic. They were following the larger animals, those big kills, the big payoff, the woolly mammoth. And I think when we reflect on that, we could say, well, why did they stop? Did they say, yeah, that woolly mammoth, not so tasty, a whole lot of work getting at that meat? Or was something else taking place, an environmental issue related perhaps to climate change? I'm leading us here to a conclusion that we're going to discuss. Yes, climate change plays a significant role in us changing our subsistence strategy or the way that we provide for ourselves. We had pointed out that Paleolithic groups, they were fairly small in size, and this was adaptive as well. If you have large groups and you're hunting and gathering, and you're going through those periods where there's going to be less resources, you certainly don't want a large group. So our subsistence strategies, they also dictate the structure of a group, of a society. Small, neat, clean, and you're able to survive. The more people you begin to add to that, if I can draw upon this idea of a Malthusian crisis, that's going to become more of a reality. And it does as we start to progress into the Neolithic Revolution. And finally, we pointed out that these groups were egalitarian. They were based upon equality, very few, if any, divisions of labor. People made their own tools. You couldn't go a few huts down the road because there wasn't a few huts down the road and knock on Sarah or Bill's door and say, hey, you know what? I need X, Y, or Z, and have them manufacture it for you. People possess that knowledge. They provided for themselves. Let's move to the next slide. When we look at the dwellings, for example, and art that was common during the Paleolithic period, as pointed out, it really characterizes that type of movement. But what we're also seeing here is, if we look on the right side of the screen, a number of interesting artifacts, and it provides us insight into their mind. So, for example, the first image we're looking at is called the Venus of Willendorf. Perhaps we should be censoring that. We don't mean to be pornographic here. But people have tried to consider, what does the Venus of Willendorf represent? And the current thinking on this is it's a type of fertility goddess. It represents something that was important within their society, but also represents kind of a really interesting question. Why do women procreate? Men don't. And at this point of time, people really didn't understand the relationship between sexual intercourse and 9 months later producing a child. What was obvious to them was woman was creator. So within this egalitarian model, I think the other thing that we could underscore is the fact that women perhaps were afforded a little more status than we like to think right now. Looking back at the Paleolithic, they had that one major difference, one fascinating, unexplainable thing that they did. They procreated. They produced new life, and not only did they produce new life, but they were also able to produce food for that new life. This is amazing, I think, if we put it in that non-scientific perspective, the way that they would have seen it. Moving a little bit further to the image on the far right, we also see some of the first types of art that began to emerge. So the first image is a figurative art. sculptures, and then later on we start to see people begin to leave their mark, for example, on the inside of cave walls. And I think this handprint, it's very much like when I was young and I came across fresh concrete, I put my hand in it and I was saying, I exist, I'm here, this is me. And this is probably what they're doing as well. So, looking at the dwellings and art that exist during this period, we could say that they dwelled in caves. We had already talked about the role of fire. And then eventually they started to shift towards tents at the end of this upper Paleolithic. So a fairly simple tent, a structure that would provide them with some shelter as they lived in that nomadic style of life. As pointed out, we see the emergence of figurative art, so a sculpture of the Venus of Willendorf, for example, and then non-figurative art. We see an example here as well. People begin to express themselves on cave walls, and eventually this becomes much more complex over time as well. Sorry if you were waiting on the last slide. I forgot to tell you to advance. I apologize. The other question I think we can ask is, why was meat the focus in the Paleolithic? What was it about the acquisition of meat in contrast to, for example, plant life? And as I pointed out, they certainly used plants. They ate roots, tubers, all of that stuff figured into their diet. However, grains were not there. Why? What was going on that people decided that they didn't want to eat grains? Let's take a look at some of the ancient foodstuffs that would have existed during the Paleolithic, and I think that'll give us a pretty good idea about the payoff that an individual would receive from meat in contrast, for example, to carrots or tubers or even a watermelon. And think today, this nice big watermelon, lots of flesh inside of there, tasty. What was the case historically? Let's move to the next slide. So here we're looking at natural or ancient corn on the left side of the screen, circa 7,000 before the Common Era, or roughly 9,000, 8 to 9,000 years ago, in and abouts there, and much earlier. And you'll see in contrast to artificial corn, and we're calling it that because we've domesticated it. We've created the corn as we have it today. Historically, corn was small, and you're seeing 19 millimeters there. That was the corn. It's not even large enough that we can see it other than a squiggly line. And the only way to get at this was by peeling it, hammering it repeatedly with a hard object, and apparently it tastes really dry. It's like raw potatoes. Blah. Who wants to eat that? And the payoff here is 5 to 10 very hard kernels. Now, corn emerges in Central America, and eventually it's domesticated, and we start to see the modern varieties that we have today. Let's move to the next slide. Peaches. I love peaches. The Winona Peach Festival. Just an awesome, awesome fruit. Looking at the natural peach, some 6,000 years ago, we see that it's 25 millimeters in size. That's really small. You know, it's what, about the size of a quarter at very best. It tastes earthy, sweet, sour, slightly salty. I'm not sure I'd be going to the Winona Peach Festival for peaches that looked like that. And if we look at what's available there as a payoff, it's got a waxy skin, 36% of it stone, 64% edible flesh out of 25 millimeters. Now this originates in China. Eventually it's domesticated. It goes through the process of artificial selection. And we have something that we're familiar with today that's about 90% edible flesh and sweet, delicious, very enjoyable. Let's move to the next slide. Natural watermelon. Watermelon, I love it. However, natural watermelon, approximately, 5,000 years before the present, or 3,000 BCE. I'm going to correct that there. We don't like to use that BC, as I've already pointed out. And this is 50 millimeters in size. Well, I'm going to guesstimate, what about the size of a loonie, in around there. And it's extremely bitter. Not only is it bitter, but if we look over here, you're going to open it with a hammer or a sharp object. And not only is it difficult to get at, but it causes inflammation. I'm not sure that I'm interested in eating natural watermelon. And in the same way, when we think back to Paleolithic peoples, are you really going to engage in all of this work to get at this little bit of flesh on the inside? I don't think so. I think of when I eat a pomegranate. I do not like eating pomegranates because there's way too much work involved in getting those little bits outside of that shell that's there. Let's move to the next slide. Carrots. Okay, so on the right hand side of the screen, we're seeing more of a modern carrot, an improvement over time. If we go back to the early varieties that were domesticated, or even prior to that, they're on the left hand side of the screen. And again, the payoff there is not substantial. That does not look like a carrot to me, and I'd have to collect a whole lot of them, in fact, to be able to eat them. Now, this is the other component. If we take into consideration the Pleistocene, what we need to imagine here is that environment was radically different than our environment today. We're seeing climate change, human-caused climate change, but that human-caused climate change really is on the heels of natural climate change. Our Earth has been getting warmer over the last 20,000 years and wetter naturally. In a cooler environment, a cooler, drier environment, this type of stuff is not going to be abundant. So not only is the payoff pretty low, but you're going to have to do a lot of searching for this type of food. Let's move to the next slide. Let's talk about grains. What we're looking at on the left side is our modern grain, bulking grain, and on the right hand side of the screen, we're looking at ancient grain. It's tiny. And again, can you imagine the amount of work that you would need to put in? And think back to those myths. We said that people assumed with farming, it reduced the amount of time that we needed to put into our subsistence strategies. Not if we're collecting grains like this. We're going to have to collect a lot of them. We're going to have to process a lot of them. A lot of work is going to go into that, and the payoff is going to be quite low. So I think the question becomes ultimately, why did we do this? Why did we start eating this stuff? It's fairly obvious why people went for the big kill, why they went for the animals or the food that was readily available. For example, shellfish, pistachios, that type of stuff. Nuts. But grains? And grains really become the focus, or the emphasis, as we're looking at the Neolithic Revolution. And really, we've never turned back. Think about how many foods are incorporate or are based on grains. Let's move to the next slide. So to understand the development or the invention of agriculture, we've got to take a look at climate change and the last glacial maximum, the LGM, and the Younger Dryas. These are two really important events in the emergence of farming. Let's move to the next slide. So what we're looking at here is change over time. So on the left-hand side of the screen, we see the Pleistocene, and we see, in comparison to where we are today, far, far right, the environment was much cooler. If it's cooler, there's going to be less rainfall. It's going to be a drier environment. So let's highlight that there. There's the Pleistocene. And in contrast to where we are, we're seeing a substantial increase in temperature over time. We've gotten warmer, at least 10 degrees warmer since the Pleistocene. Now, at this point of time, during the Pleistocene, we have a lot of large, cold adapted animals. For example, the woolly rhino, the woolly mammoth, those big kills that we think of when we think of a caveman, for example, out hunting. Now, if we follow this model, we see just a little bit further past that circle that I have, we all of a sudden have a drastic increase in temperature. And that really marks the beginning or the period that led to the Holocene. We have a warming trend, and animals needed to adapt to that. A woolly mammoth, the woolly rhino, they just didn't do well. So we have to imagine that food stuff begins to disappear, and that's going to force us to look for new stuff. Not only does it force us to look for new stuff, but fortunately for our ancestors, new stuff was emerging in this warmer, wetter environment. There we are right there. We've gotten warmer as we're progressing towards the Holocene, and we have a climate that's favorable for the development of abundant grains. The area that we're looking at in our textbook and that we're talking about is the hilly flanks. This is in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, so around Turkey and modern day Iraq. I'll show you a map shortly of this area. So what begins to happen is we start to get abundant grains. We start to see more pistachios, for example, and lentils higher in the mountains where the rainfall is higher. And people begin to settle there. They haven't invented agriculture. They've begun to settle around these crops that they could gather food from. The other great thing about these crops is other animals are also coming to that. It's a resource for them, and we can trap and we can hunt. So it's at this point of time that we start to see people adopting a sedentary life. This is the Mesolithic. Now imagine, just as you're starting to figure things out and your caloric intake has definitely dropped because you don't have those big kills and you're trying to use these ancient grains, for example, all of a sudden there's a mini ice age. I'm going to highlight it here with a circle. We call it the Younger Dryas. This ice age went on for at least 1,000 years. And what happened is it forced people out of the mountainous regions, less rainfall now, in search of water, and they begin to move into the lower areas of Mesopotamia, areas where there's a regular supply of water. And that's where they begin to train water. They start to create irrigation ditches, and they take those seeds that they had collected, that they had stored, that they were collecting, and they begin to plant them. So it's at that point of time in the Younger Dryas that we start to see purposeful cultivation. These are the first farmers. So this mini ice age, the Younger Dryas, it forces grain collectors, people who are collecting these grains, it forces them out of the hilly flanks and into regions with reliable sources of water. And in doing so, it's those individuals that invent agriculture. And if we follow this map just a little bit further, this graph here, we can see all of a sudden we start to move out of that ice age, and we have that continuing warming trend. And now people can engage in full-fledged agriculture. And that's when we start to see the development of major civilizations, for example, by the Sumerians. Let's move to the next slide. In the Mesolithic, then, these individuals who are grappling with this climate change, the fluctuations in temperature, and coming up with new subsistence strategies, we see the development of new tools. As pointed out, these individuals become sedentary, and if we look at the right-hand side of the screen, we see a really interesting image. These individuals invented something called an adze. Think of it as an ancient type of axe, something that could be used to carve. What this provides us again with is further insight into some of the strategies that people were beginning to employ. They started to carve out trees, and in doing so, they were able to engage in offshore fishing and incorporate more foodstuffs into their economy. So the Mesolithic, what we begin to see is forests, they start to replace the tundra as that last glacial maximum ends. Around Europe, we refer to it as the Worm Glacial. So we're seeing a lot of changes taking place. The forests that we're familiar with today, they're beginning to emerge. In addition, the cold adapted animals that were common during the Paleolithic, they start to migrate more north. It's just too warm in these areas, so they start to move further north. And we think that we end up hunting them, a lot of them, to extinction as well. The ones that we don't hunt to extinction, they can't adapt fast enough and they eventually meet the same fate. They become extinct as well. As pointed out, we see a dietary shift here. We're moving from that strict Paleolithic diet to one that relies upon grains, new plant foods that are starting to become abundant, and we start to rely upon the animals in those areas where the food's growing, also around the rivers and on the lakes. And fortunately, we're thinking about how do we get at this. So when we think of the development of humankind, here people are really trying to problem solve, and they're dealing with one of the basic issues that started to emerge. And, it existed in the past, but I think more so now. How do we make ends meet? As for tools, we start to see those microblade technologies, the microliths or the bladelets that I've been talking about in the Mesolithic. So we see sharpened stone tools, and that allows for people to develop sickles, something that can be used to process or gather these new grains. The adze, as pointed out, we see an image of that there, and also knives as well, the microlith. Let's move on to the next slide. As for the dwellings and art that we see during the Mesolithic, here we're starting to see, as pointed out, a permanent type of settlement that begins to emerge. So the simpler type of tents or huts that would have been common during the Upper Paleolithic, that's replaced with a more permanent structure. And over time, these structures become more and more complex. So during the Mesolithic, people are in a semi-sedentary or a sedentary type of lifestyle, and villages are beginning to emerge. In addition to villages emerging, cave art, it's become more complex, as does sculpture. So we see a couple of examples here. Jewelry is starting to become important and adorning one's body. That might indicate that also those structural or those ranked changes in society are beginning to take place as well. On the far side of the screen, we can see that mortar and pestle, and that tells us that yes, people have started to design ways to process the grains. They're beginning to rely upon it. And with that evidence, we just don't see that in the Paleolithic. And I don't know if you've ever come across wild grains and you've tried to process it. It's something that you can't just chew and eat. There's a lot of undigestible material there. You'd be chewing forever and swallowing this stuff, and then it would be exiting pretty much in the same form that you swallowed it. It needs to be broken down. So without that type of tool, which there's no archaeological support for during the Paleolithic, we know that they weren't relying upon those grains. They weren't desirable enough for the limited amount that was, in fact, around. Let's progress on to the next slide. So here in the Neolithic, we're looking at those individuals like the Natufians that have begun to move out of the hilly flanks and down into the lower regions in search of water. They begin to train that water, and they start to develop something called floodplain irrigation. Now, floodplain irrigation, it's going to be a problem for them. It's a great way for disease to fester and infect individuals. We'll tackle that a little bit later on. So these individuals that are responsible for inventing agriculture, they've experienced further climatic change, and that's caused them to move into the valleys. And as we've pointed out, that key environmental change, that event, is the Younger Dryas. We want to make sure that we can remember that for the test. In addition to moving down into the lower regions, these individuals are also responsible for beginning to produce the very first domesticated variety of grains. So they start to select for larger varieties. How do they do that? Well, they eat the smaller ones and they save the larger ones, and those are the ones that they plant next year. So these individuals, they're collecting grains and eventually they start to keep animals as well. Now that's going to be a problem as well. 61% of the diseases that impact us today, they're referred to as zoonotic diseases. They come from animals. So this is another reason why we saw that first epidemiological transition, and it's associated with the invention of farming. Populations, they're starting to increase now as people have become sedentary and they've invented agriculture. The weather's started to be more conducive to the development of farming. There's a problem with that as well. As populations increase, what do you do about hygiene issues? Where do you do your business? They don't have toilets. Where do they put their garbage? So a number of issues really start to confound the problems here and again play a role in shaping the experience of disease during the Neolithic Revolution. And a lot of this stuff never goes away. In the Middle East, there's a couple of cultures. Our textbook talks about Urbadian and Natufian cultures, Natufian and Urbadian cultures. The Natufians and the Urbadians, they're both individuals that occupied regions of the hilly flanks. And they both began to move into these lower regions, and they were responsible for inventing agriculture. Let's take a look at the Zagros Mountains. And in the Zagros Mountains, here we have a group, for example, that we refer to as the Natufians on the western side and the Urbadians on the eastern side. And here we see a map of the Fertile Crescent. So the more northern regions up towards Turkey, that's where people are settling. First, those mountains, and then they begin to move down in between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. Archaeological evidence has looked at a number of butchering sites in the Zagros Mountains, and one of the things that bioarchaeologists do, or even forensic anthropologists do, is we sort and we count bones. What we want to know is how many males or females are represented in this particular sample. Are the individuals old? Are they young? Are they middle-aged? And then we can build an understanding or at least an understanding of the context of these particular butchering sites. And that's exactly what archaeologists have done in the Zagros Mountains. And what they found was a high ratio of male goats compared to female goats. Now, what does that mean? There's a lot of male goats being butchered. Why aren't they butchering female goats? What do you think? I'll give you a second. When we look at this, and I think if you're kind of on to what we're underscoring here, is people began to recognize that females were much more valuable than males. Why? Females produce new life. Not only do they produce new life, but they also produce milk. Now, at this time, people were not drinking raw milk. They hadn't developed the mutations that would allow them to digest that lactase or that lactose. They use milk for to create yogurt first, and then eventually cheese, and that's a way of getting the lactose out of that milk, making it more digestible. But looking at the high ratio of male goats in these butcher sites tells us that they had decided we really don't need the male goats. We only need one or two to inseminate the females. Females much more valuable. Let's keep them. They're a great resource. And from an eating perspective, let's eat the male goats. So we can conclude here that females, they were being bred, and that is where we begin with domestication. Not only are they being bred, but you're going to have a way to keep these animals as well. Now that becomes a problem. As we begin to keep animals, This is the first time in human history that we're in close contact with them on a regular basis. In the past, we hunted them, we killed them, we ate them, and if they were carrying a disease, well, I'm sure we got sick. But now we're in constant contact, and that provides an avenue or a way that disease, as it emerges among animals or things that they just naturally carry, they're also undergoing mutations, and it can spread to humans. Again, looking back at that first epidemiological transition that we're going to talk about, animal domestication plays a significant role in this. So here in the Neolithic, and we're really seeing an interesting transition. Look at the image on the top right side of your screen. This is the type of village or city that begins to emerge among the Natufians. It looks a heck of a lot like an apartment complex to me. If we reflect back on Paleolithic and Mesolithic dwellings, the Paleolithic, they really lived within nature. Caves, small tents, doorways, ground level. The same thing is true of the Mesolithic. They're more permanent, they're semi-permanent. These individuals also have entrances ground level. I think what's striking about this type of structure that we're looking at in the Neolithic is that opening is no longer ground level. You've got to reach it by a ladder. Not only is it accessible only by a ladder, if we look at the windows, they're also really small. Why? Why do you think that the roofs have moved to the top and the windows, when they do include them, they're small? I'll give you a second. You know, when I think about this, I think what strikes me, and I'll reflect upon my own experiences, when I was young and we went out camping or mountain climbing, we bivvied. We didn't take tents. I really wasn't scared about bears. I wasn't scared about anything out there in the wild. I was living within nature. When I go out with my family now, I do not sleep at night. Honestly, I just don't sleep at night. Any sound I hear, I'm jumping up with the bear spray, wondering, is it a bear? Is it some evil person coming to attack my family? I don't know. I'm not having a good time out there anymore. And my perspective, I think, on life has changed over time. I've become over time perhaps domesticated, if I can use that word. I think we're seeing the same thing here. The psychology in the Neolithic of these individuals, it's changed. It's one of protection. People can't get in through that little doorway, or window, I should say, on the side. Animals, once you take up the ladder, and I don't know too many large animals that can walk up ladders, they can't get in the hole in the roof, that doorway in the roof. So this is about protection, conserving, protecting one's resources. What we're seeing then in the Neolithic is a transition from villages to larger villages and then eventually cities. And absolutely massive cities begin to develop. With those changes, we also see changes in social organization. As I've pointed out, societies become ranked or stratified, and we have a lot of inequality beginning to emerge. Some people get more than others. And trade is also beginning to emerge. And we'll talk a little bit about writing in our next module, but this is also why writing emerges. It's to record economic transactions. You know, how many goats did Hammurabi lend Gilgamesh, and how do you remember all of that stuff? Well, you write it down, you create a chart. So that's also where writing begins here in the Middle East, Mesopotamia, with the ancient Sumerians as the Neolithic Revolution continues. As for some of the other elements, pottery, this is starting to become a really important endeavor. You need somewhere to put your surplus. For the very first time in human history, surplus is beginning to emerge. We start to see divisions of labor as we do various areas of specialization. So in contrast, again, to that Paleolithic, when anybody could make the tools that they needed, the clothing that you needed, you just had that know-how. Now we're seeing specialization. People that are just making pots, individuals that are just making tools, individuals that are cultivating, individuals that are planting, and perhaps more importantly, individuals that are protecting. we start to see the emergence of a military and a leader of that military who eventually becomes the king. And as time progresses, for example, in Mesopotamia, that king eventually says, I'm not just a man, I'm a god. And now we've got some really serious political changes taking place. That's where we'll leave it off right now. In our next segment, we'll talk a little bit about the first epidemiological transition and the impact that farming and disease had upon these individuals. Take care.